Hi, my name is Professor Earl Smith, and I'm speaking this morning on the topic of race and solitary confinement. The formal title is Way Down in the Hole, Race, Intimacy, and the Reproduction of Racial Ideologies in Solitary Confinement. Slide. Here, I'm showing you a slide that acknowledges my wonderful teammates, some great people to work with, and we've been involved in a larger project over the past couple of years. Slide. Dr. Terry Coopers, in his book entitled Solitary, The Inside Story of Supermax Isolation and How We Can Abolish It, copyright date 2017, he says, solitary confinement units are the sites of some of the worst racism in prisons. We agree. Slide. We're also acknowledging the role that mental health workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, researchers have contributed to understanding solitary confinement. Their work is critical. We learned a great deal from many of these people, and many are a part of this wonderful symposium. Our work acknowledges theirs, but our focus is a little different. We went into our project trying to understand what it was like for staff and inmates living and working in solitary confinement. Slide. What emerged organically was the story of the ways in which the specific structures of solitary confinement work. One, they produce and reproduce white racial resentment on the part of correctional officers, and two, the Black and brown inmates having experiences of institutional racism. Slide. We utilized face-to-face interviews with 75 inmates and 25 staff. The inmates lasted usually from 45 minutes to an hour. The interviews were semi-structured. We used ethnographic methods, and we were in solitary confinement for approximately 200 plus hours. We also utilized critical race theory to analyze the data. Slide. As you can see from the table, Black men are disproportionately represented in prison and more so in solitary. To make this work, I'm going to tell a few stories of things that inmates and staff told us. Slide. It's important to point out that I could feel the racism upon entering each and every one of the prisons. There were 8. I was the only Black man on the research team, but the research team was all white females. When management and the COs found out that I was one of the professors, their demeanor changed. At more than one of the prisons, as the day wore on, or we were in our second day of work, COs, now comfortable with me, would hint how lucky I was to spend time in the company of all these white women. My interactions with staff and inmates foreshadowed what I would hear. Black COs reported that Black inmates often assumed they shared a common ground. White COs believed that Black inmates were getting a better deal than they were, just as I, a Black man, had more education and a better job than they did. Slide. Scholar, an inmate we interviewed, is a Black man in his mid-30s. He's dark-skinned and he wears his hair in dreadlocks. He's tall and muscular. In fact, his body barely fit in the cage where we interviewed him. Scholar has been in prison since he was 17 years old. He admitted that his adjustment to prison was difficult. He spent most of the first 5 years in the hole. But as he aged, he has learned how to navigate prison, and he has dedicated his life to being a good role model for younger inmates. We call him Scholar because he's a prolific reader. Scholar says that SCI Wannabe is, quote, one of the most racist prisons, and that they have no problem there calling us the N-word, end of quote. Slide. According to Scholar, one of the reasons that SCI Wannabe is one of the most racist prisons is it is located in rural Pennsylvania. Inmates are more diverse than COs, not just in terms of race, but where they come from. The inmates come from Pittsburgh, Philly, New Jersey, New York. The COs are all from the local area. He said, it's like I watch CNN and they watch Fox all day long. Part of ethnography, qualitative research, also meant spending time when we weren't in the prison in the local community. We stayed in the local motels that served the local prison towns. We ate breakfast and dinner in these local towns. We talked to servers, hotel staff, and others. We also confirmed our observations and what we heard from the staff and inmates with census data. Prison towns like Larrabee are white, rural communities, very poor. Scholars living deep inside the hidden world of solitary confinement, he comes to the same conclusions we do, that the structures of solitary confinement and the siting of prisons in rural white communities contributes to racial antagonisms and the maintenance of racial hierarchies. Slide. When we asked the inmates, Black and white, they reported that the COs often told racist jokes. One Black inmate told us he was forced to cut his dreadlocks, and others simply stated, quote, white inmates are treated better than Black and Hispanic inmates, end of quote. For example, one inmate we interviewed, we call him Pitiful, was in solitary confinement for fighting. He claimed that he was defending himself from being raped. Pitiful was a light-skinned Black man in his early 20s with a slight build, close-cropped hair, and he told us that he has been gang raped 10 times in general population. He blames the COs for not protecting him. When we asked him what the COs were doing that contributed to his being such a frequent target of rape, Pitiful replied, quote, in general population, there is only one CO for over 20 inmates. Guys, the inmates, are all wearing uniforms. The COs says, Black guys, they all look alike, end of quote. Fly. But it's not just the racial makeup of the men incarcerated in solitary confinement, it's also the racial complexion of the men working in solitary confinement. The vast majority of the staff in solitary confinement units are white men. There are a few women, but mostly white men. And in the prisons where we conducted our research, when it came to the correctional officers, lieutenants, the sergeants, and even the mental health staff, they were all white with very, very few exceptions. Cell assignments are like buying a home in the free world. Inmates spend 23 hours a day in the cell for days, for weeks, for months, even years. Racial housing segregation on the inside looks much like racial housing segregation on the outside. Only in solitary, it's not a realtor who steers Black people to certain neighborhoods. It's the person making the cell assignment. One of several of the major findings of our research is that race is the primary factor in cell assignments. We were hanging out in the office when a CO came in to alert the unit manager, Steve, that a new inmate had arrived and was waiting in the strip cage for a cell assignment. We asked if we could watch the process of cell assignments. Steve enthusiastically invited us to observe the entire process. In solitary, everything is racialized, including cell assignments. Slide. Behind unit manager Steve's desk is a wall with a big white board that is marked with grids and letters and numbers and inmate ID cards. This board tells the story of every man locked in solitary confinement. Who is in a cell, which cell, whether the inmate can eat pork or not, whether he's on AC or DC status, whether he has a razor restriction, and his projected release date from solitary. The board allows Steve, or really anyone, including us, to easily get a snapshot of the unit. The wall serves another essential function. It is the primary tool Steve used to make cell assignments. When we asked the unit manager, Steve, how he made his cell assignments, he said that race was his first consideration. We asked why. Unit manager Steve said, quote, the white guys wouldn't live with the black guys and vice versa. Slide. When we talked with officers and other staff about their perceptions of race in solitary, what was most striking was the different responses from white and black staff. White officers did their best to avoid the question, but when they couldn't, they offered what sociologists refer to as symbolic racism responses. For example, in conversations with COs in the gang unit, they also argued that they don't consider race as much as gang affiliation. And yet, despite a bit of slippage, gang affiliation serves as a primary proxy for race. Other staff indicated it wasn't race, that it was culture. One afternoon, I was sitting in a lieutenant's office waiting for my next interview, and I overheard this conversation. There were 5 or 6 COs standing around shooting the breeze. It was around 1 in the afternoon, and their shift was about to end. They had worked a long day, and they were taking a break after hours of being on their feet. The unit manager, Steve, dismissed race and instead invoked a phrase that white people are more comfortable with, culture. Steve remarks, quote, I used to run a mentoring group. I thought that if the guys could see that someone had believed in them, that they might turn their lives around and live for something bigger than themselves. I asked the guys, think of someone you would consider a mentor. And they were like, what's a mentor? See, they come from a different culture from us. Their culture is different from ours. I stopped running the group, end of quote, slide. Across our prison visits, there were very, very few black staff of any rank working in any solitary confinement unit at any of the prisons where we conducted the research. When we asked them about the differences they observed when it came to race in rural versus urban prisons, they talked not about the prisons, but about the counties themselves. In urban jails, the majority of the staff live in urban areas. As a result, their life outside the prison is far more integrated. They grew up going to integrated schools. They played on integrated sport teams. In high school, they had normal interactions with people of other races. All of the black staff we interviewed continued to live in Pittsburgh and continued to commute to SCI Wannabe. They would rather spend 3 hours a day commuting than live in rural white Larrabee County. Quote, I can relate to the experiences of Black inmates. I am aware of the racism in this place. I am not going to act like I can't relate. I understand this is Larrabee County, end of quote. Slide. Black COs describe a world in which white men who have few, if any, normalized interactions with Black people spend 8 to 16 hours a day arguing and fighting with Black men in cages. Black men, some of whom have done terrible things, Black men who are angry that they are locked in cages, Black men who sometimes do horrible things like throw feces and urine on the COs. Black staff observed, quote, everything we are taught, stereotypes, is reinforced. The racial segregation in solitary confinement confirms over and over again, day in and day out, all of the racial stereotypes we associate with Black men. Black staff also faced their own set of challenges. White COs and white inmates made assumptions about Black staff. The white guys assumed, said a Black CO, that I help the Black guys because we share a common ground, the hood. I'm not from the hood. I have a master's degree, end of quote. Fred, an inmate on death row, when asked why there is no Black officers, concurred. He says, quote, as soon as they get any time in the institutions, they are removed. They are seen to be too friendly with the Black inmates, end of quote. Slide. Many of the COs we interviewed and spent time with talked about the fact that they felt like glorified babysitters. For those who have not been in a solitary confinement unit, this might seem like an odd analogy. But in fact, many of the fundamental features of solitary confinement require COs to do the same kind of work we associate with daycare. One of the intended or unintended consequences of the 23-hour lockdown in solitary confinement units is the requirement that all meals be eaten in the inmate's cell. In practice, this means that correctional officers must hand deliver trays to the inmates 3 times a day and pick them up after each meal. None of the prisons we worked in have elevators. You walk up and down the stairs. Each tray must be passed through a wicket in order to safeguard the COs from the possibility that an inmate may throw urine or feces, putting them in danger during this exchange. As a result, passing trays is a labor-intensive, time-consuming task that some inmates ranked as a benefit of being in solitary confinement because they didn't have to walk in the rain or cold weather to the chow hall, a task many correctional officers, on the other hand, came to resent. Trays, for example, are not only contested terrain because their passing is considered a dangerous or high-risk activity, but also because they are an instance of flipping the script of racialized roles in the United States. Black people serve white people, not the reverse. Many COs express deep resentment for the inmates they are paid to oversee. CO Bunker, who served several tours in Iraq, returned to a place where he feels, to use Arlie Hochschild's analysis, like a stranger in his own land. Despite the fact that he personally locks people in cages 24 hours a day and enforces a set of policies and practices that denies them their basic human rights, he believes that inmates are more privileged than those of their victims and even of himself. He says, quote, "The biggest downfall of the Department of Corrections is there are no victims' rights anymore. Inmates get TVs, tablets, kiosks, email. Victims get nothing. They don't get their family member back," end of quote. Slide. COs often engage in language of white racial resentment. From the perspective of many white COs, rather than punishing bad people, they are serving them. They are bringing food to their cells, cleaning their dirty dishes, much like what you see waitresses doing in the local diners they frequent. They are escorting them to the shower and the yard and bringing them shampoo and soap and razors and toilet paper, much like a housekeeper restocking motel rooms or providing turn-down service. This is not at all the work they want to do. This is not the work they were trained to do. And to add insult to injury, this work flips the racial hierarchy on its head. From their view, Black men lay back in their cells and watch the Golf Channel while being waited on by the COs, many of whom, as CO Porter reveals, can't afford the Golf Channel in their own home cable package. And it is precisely this disconnect between job and work that leads to the development of white racial resentment COs experience. This finding is underscored by Arlie Hochschild, who argues in her book, Strangers in Their Own Land, published in 2018, that the COs perceive a world in which they have been standing in line, doing the right thing, working hard, waiting patiently, and they look up and other people are jumping the line. Oddly enough, from this perspective, this includes Black and brown men in solitary. Symbolic and overt racism are baked into solitary confinement. Race determines the likelihood that one will be sentenced to and confined in solitary confinement, thus shaping the complexion of those behind bars. It also shapes who works in solitary confinement units. Locating prisons that house inmates who are primarily from urban, diverse communities in counties like Larrabee that are more than 95% white produces a racial hierarchy of power. And though they often feel disenfranchised themselves, the COs and other staff who are almost entirely white have all the power, and inmates who are disproportionately Black and brown are on the receiving end of extreme dehumanizing behavior. Slide. In practice, white racial resentment is dangerous in solitary confinement for at least 2 reasons. One, it allows COs to dehumanize inmates to the point that even severe abuse, the beating or raping of inmates, was justified. And two, more commonly, it led to COs burning inmates on meals. This means walking past their cell without delivering breakfast or lunch or dinner, burning the inmates on the meals, burning the inmates on showers, meaning you don't let the inmates out to take their shower 3 times a week, burning them on the yard, meaning you don't let them go outside for an hour a day, and imposing further restrictions on mail or tablet privileges and the likes. Many COs saw abuse, both common and severe, as their only power in the flipped script environment of solitary. Finally, though the white racial resentment that is produced and reproduced in prisons did not originate there, it infiltrates the very communities in which COs live, and they are precisely the places that Trump has been able to mobilize. As I record this, we have just a couple of days until the election. Over the past weekend, Trump supporters followed and harassed the Biden-Harris bus as it traveled through Texas. Trump praised his supporters for their loyalty and their actions. White racial resentment is central to the racism in solitary confinement, where it is reinforced by the flipped script of solitary, where white men serve Black men in cages. The experiences of white COs in solitary confinement reproduced and is reproduced by the white racial resentment and ideologies of white supremacy that we see in rural white communities like Larrabee, the same communities Trump mobilizes.